This is Success Stories, a program of the Sorrell College of Business at Troy University. I'm Alan Mendenhall, Associate Dean of the Sorrell College of Business and Executive Director of the Manuel H. Johnson Center for Political Economy. Success Stories is a program that highlights the lives and careers of people who have accomplished great things, and my guest today is Jay Nordlinger, who is one such person. Jay is a senior editor at National Review. He's in town, sponsored by the National Review Institute. He's speaking at various universities, including Troy University tonight while he's in town. Jay, thanks for coming on the show.
Pleasure to be on.
Well, I just want to start by talking about writing, because that's what you are. You are a writer. When did you first start writing? How did you fall in love with writing? Did you start writing as a child? Did you start writing when you were a college student at Michigan? Congrats on the national championship, by the way.
Thank you so much. I think we have a full year to savor it, right? Is that the way it works?
I think that a lot of people in Alabama have learned that that's how it works.
Oh, well, Alabamians are so spoiled when it comes to national championships. My gosh, it's abnormal for you all not to have a national championship, at least for the Crimson Tide.
Oh, yes, that's true. That's true.
Writing, it's funny. Most everyone talks, and most everyone writes. Most people don't play the flute, and they're professional flutists, you know. Bill Buckley called himself a performing writer. Once he wrote a whole book about a single week in his life. And people said, what an arrogant thing to do. How can you think you're so great? You're writing about a single week in your life. He said, I'm a performing writer. That's what I do. And then he did it again. He wrote another book about a different week in his life. He called himself a performing writer. Alan, I don't know. I grew up in sort of a verbal family, a musical family, a family that loved words and phrases and vernacular and puns and jokes and stories. A verbally fluent family, my grandparents and parents. And it was always in the air, I suppose. That's a very interesting question, one whose answer I have botched. It's also an awkward thing to talk about. Probably if you can talk about it, you may not be able to do it, you know? I think that writing should be as close to spoken speech as possible, maybe a little more formalized. And the best writers I know and have known have really written the way they talk. Bill Buckley did. Norman Podhoretz mainly does. Mark Halperin pretty much does, you know? And I think writing ought to be pretty much as natural as speech, depending. And I mean, imitation, I promise I'll shut up in a second. By the way, you know, the more unsure the answerer, the longer he goes.
That's the best way, because then you forget the question.
Certainly earlier in my life, I knew a lot of Tom Wolfe imitators, and you could tell. Tom Wolfe's style was just right for Tom Wolfe, but maybe not for others. So I think a good writer is not conscious of his style. It's just the way he thinks and talks and puts it on the page.
You write a lot about music. Do you have a musical background? Do you play an instrument? What did you study at Michigan?
I was brought up a musician. I was trained as a musician in a musical family. And so I was steeped in music. In college and graduate school, I did what you might call general liberal arts, with an emphasis on history, Romance languages, anthropology, English, that sort of thing. College. My
son plays the bassoon, and I know nothing about musical instruments.
Very expensive instrument, by the way.
Well, everyone tells me these things. Well, that's funny that you say that. When he first got assigned the bassoon, because they test your mouth, they test your hands, they see what instruments you might have facility with or which instruments aren't for you. And he went into this testing wanting to play the oboe. He came out assigned the bassoon. And all of a sudden I'm told, oh, this is a double reed, and this is a very complex instrument, and it's a very sophisticated instrument.
It's so expensive.
And they said, would you would you like to rent or buy it? And I thought, well, of course, I'd love to buy it. I'd love for us to own it. And they said, oh, okay, well, it's going to be
It'll
like
be $1 million.
$25,000 for this cheap version. I said, we'll rent. We'll rent.
Yeah. See if he likes it. See if he can play it.
Exactly
Yeah.
right. But he's stuck with it, and he's doing quite well. He just made all-state band. But
Terrific.
when you choose subjects for music, do you typically cover particular events? Like, for example, there's an orchestral concert, and you cover the concert, or
Well, there are reviews and there are feature pieces and there are essays. And reviews are easy. You attend a concert or opera performance and you review it. And I've done that a lot for newspapers and magazines. And you do essays on issues, issues in composition, issues in the music business, and then feature pieces, profiles. I've interviewed a great many musicians, especially venerable older musicians whose careers are over and whom you don't review anymore. You really shouldn't do a feature piece on someone you review. Those should be separate things. Classically, traditionally, there's a kind of wall there because it's not easy to there is.
Yeah.
An interviewer often befriends his interviewee and vice versa. So I've interviewed over the years lots and lots of musicians in their 70s and 80s and 90s, and it's been a total joy.
How long have you been at National Review now?
Since 1998.
So you were there with the storied William F. Buckley.
Yes, indeed. I started, the Weekly Standard started in 1995 in Washington, and I spent 3 years there and then moved to National Review in New York.
And you are actually speaking about William F. Buckley tonight on the campus of Troy University. You spoke about William F. Buckley earlier at Faulkner University.
Yeah.
Preview a little bit what you're going to say.
So you put an L in the name Faulkner, don't you? I just heard it.
I did.
I'm from Michigan and I don't.
Really?
Do you play golf or golf?
I play golf.
Interesting.
I don't know.
You say I don't have that L.
Huh, how about that? I've
All right.
never thought about this.
Yeah, so Bill's born in 1925, making next year his centennial. So we're doing it up. Yeah, and I have a Buckley talk that is a joy to give because he was a joy and is a joy.
And did you interact with him very much while you were working with him in, say, Washington, D.C.? Is that where you would primarily run across each other? New York City?
Well, the first time I met Bill was in Washington, where I was then living and working. And then I moved to New York for National Review. And Bill lived in New York, in Manhattan and in Stamford, Connecticut on Long Island Sound. Yes, we knew each other well. And it was a joy.
Well, you wrote a widely reviewed book just a few years ago, Children of Monsters, about the children of different dictators. And I recall reading about this book in many, many different outlets. Like, as I say, it was widely reviewed. What compelled you to approach that
So
subject?
now you read the reviews and not the book. That's okay, Alan.
Well,
Listen, I'll take it.
you
That's
listened
fine.
too carefully to the question. I was afraid as I was asking it that you might
read
catch
reviews. It's a very strange book, and an interesting book, I think. It's a survey of the sons and daughters of dictatorial monsters of the 20th century. And it came about because I was in Tirana, the capital of Albania, as one is, and I was given a tour of the city by a young man who worked for a government ministry. I was there under the auspices of the State Department speaking. And Enver Hoxha had been one of the worst dictators of all the dictators of the Soviet period, let's call it. It was just about the worst of them all. And I was asking about it, and it occurred to me, did he have children? And if he had, what must their lives be like? Were they pariahs? Did they have to change their name? Were they admired? Did they have to move? Were they mentally ill? What's it like to be the son or daughter of a man whose name is synonymous with murder, oppression, dictatorship, evil? And so this young man told me about the Hoxha children, what they were up to and what their lives were like a bit. And I thought, that might make a good magazine piece someday. And as my old colleague at the Standard, Matt Labash, would say, a writer never knows where his next meal is coming from, what your next subject is. And then I thought, well, maybe you could do a survey of such sons and daughters and do a whole book called Children of Monsters. And I tucked that away and then acted on it years later.
Wow.
But it began in Albania.
And how long between the time the idea came about and the time you actually published the book?
Geez, can't remember.
A long time, though.
I think, yeah, about 10 years maybe.
Yeah, that's great. Well, where do you live now?
In New York, in Manhattan.
So you're in Manhattan. And what is a typical day for you when you have writing assignments, or do you come up with your work and submit by a certain time? I mean, how do you manage your schedule as a writer?
Takes a certain discipline. You have to spend a lot of time alone writing. Paul Johnson, all of his life, all of his career, the great English writer and historian, and people would say, I want to be a writer. Johnson would say, oh, that's interesting, that's good. Be prepared to spend a lot of time alone. It's not for everyone. Books and articles don't write themselves, you know. You do. This is what Paul Johnson would say. And Kevin Williamson speaks of, who was it? Was it Hunter Thompson or Jack Kerouac or someone thought of as a real gonzo sort of writer. But this fellow, I think it was Thompson, Kevin says, had great discipline. He'd go to a hotel room for 8 hours, like a work shift, and work. And so I write columns, profiles, reviews, essays, magazine pieces. I suppose I write an article or two a day, maybe. And there's simply a process. Fred Barnes once told me, when we're at the Standard, he said, there comes a point in your career, you simply learn how to write, you know how to do it. And it's like doing a job. And it's not, there's no real sweat involved in it. You have a deadline, you meet it. It's like you're a baker. Your assignment is to make a dozen muffins. You don't wring your hands about making a dozen muffins. When you make a dozen muffins, and you get them to the person, to the public, or wherever, on time. And that's what you do in writing. It is, as David Price Jones would say, a job of work. And you simply get used to it. It's a little like punching a clock. You go to work, and here's my piece. And speaking of Fred Barnes, I learned a wonderful expression from him. We'd say we editors of the Standard would say, how's your piece, Fred? He'd say, it has the quality of doneness. It's a very important quality.
That is an important quality.
And another journalist said, I can't remember who it was, said, no piece is ever really finished. It's simply submitted, given up.
I like that.
And Bill Buckley often said that a deadline is your best friend.
What about your book on the history of the Nobel Prize? What inspired that?
Can't remember.
It seems like an unusual topic to just undertake.
That's such a great topic because it allows you to, so the Nobel Prizes begin in 1901, so it allows you to survey the 20th century, the important issues of war and peace, political developments. It's a way of looking at history, recent history. And there's this wonderful parade of personalities, the laureates, and there are all the controversies surrounding them. Writing this book about sons and daughters of dictators, I was very glad to give that up. I was glad to write it and very glad to give it up because it was marinating in some unpleasant stuff for quite a while. And I think readers feel that way. They're glad in a sense to read the book and glad when it's over. The history of the Nobel Peace Prize, I was wistful about giving up. It's just such a wonderful thing. And a reviewer of that book, you might have read the reviews, Alan, since you read the reviews. A reviewer of that book, John Bolton, said, and I was so glad he said this, he said, yes, it's a history, but it's also a book-long meditation on peace. A very interesting, multifaceted subject and one vulnerable to abuse. What is peace? Wonderful question. It's not merely the absence of war. It's not war either. Genuine peace, real peace, in a climate of freedom is a wonderful thing.
Who are some of your greatest influences?
Well, in the subjects we're talking about, Bill Buckley, Norman Podhoretz, Paul Johnson, David Price Jones, I think I mentioned all of those men already Robert Conquest, Bernard Lewis, Richard Pipes, golly, Jean-Francois Revel.
These are very much major figures in sort of post-war 20th century America. Many of them on the conservative right.
You got me. That's me.
But that's it's a very significant period. You see a lot of changes, a lot of development in the conservative movement as it coalesces around an intellectual core, which is something I would say it probably lacked.
It's all kaput, by the way.
Until and that's where I
Dunzo.
I would like to talk about that actually. I would really like to talk about that. But if you just take, and this is somewhat of an arbitrary beginning point, but we'll just say the publication of Russell Kirk's The Conservative Mind, and we'll just use that as sort of a beginning point. And you go until, I don't know, 9/11. We'll start,
good.
We'll start there, just because that's a big portion, and we see a lot of different changes from 2001 until 2024 as we sit here. You
could stop at 1991 if you wanted, but either way.
You were right in the thick of it. Describe the changes you saw as somebody that was part of the intellectual movement, as it were, somebody that was part of developing a coalition of disparate elements of the right coming together.
I wasn't part of it. I was a beneficiary of it, if you might say. It had been developed. Bill, so he was sort of a zookeeper, and he had all sorts of animals right of center in his zoo. And he was a commanding figure and a synthesizer, right? And he was a great free marketeer. He was for a robust national defense and U.S. leadership in the world. He was a social conservative with, you might say, asterisks. He was early in favor of drug legalization, along with George Shultz and Milton Friedman, and so on. But Bill, he was like that. He contained multitudes, if you will. He was a man of parts, and he had different streaks in him. For example, he'd say, every conservative has within him a streak of libertarianism. How wide is your streak? I always say mine is like an accordion. It contracts or expands and contracts again, depending on the issue. But a lot of people were sort of clustered around National Review and commentary. Irving Kristol had his publications, and there was great ferment. And there are all those wonderful people who'd come from the left, or certainly were Democrats. I remember, oh gosh, Max Kampelman and Gene Kirkpatrick and Richard Pearl, the Scoop Jacksonians, they all meant a great deal to me. And because, the very big thing was the Cold War, was the Iron Curtain, and this terrible competition with the Soviet Union. And it played out in Latin America, and in the Caribbean, and Africa, and East Asia, and everywhere else. It was a titanic struggle between the forces of freedom and anti-freedom. And our heroes were people like, Lech Walesa or Wałęsa, and Václav Havel, and Solzhenitsyn, and Sakharov, and Anatoly Sharansky, as we then called him. That was my, if I may put it this way, mental milieu.
And when you say the conservative movement as such is now dead, at least the conservative intellectual movement, what do you mean by that?
It's different. Well, it's
or done, not dead, but done.
It's done. That's what we see before us. We're in a completely different era, and populism is in the saddle, and nationalism is in the saddle, and the basic questions are being tested. What is conservatism? That answer varies according to time and place, because the great question about it is, well, what do you want to conserve? And in Europe, that answer has traditionally been hierarchy, birth, station, heredity, class, throne and altar, and so on. In America, a lot of people complained about this, I could cite some interesting things, but conservatism has often meant liberalism, classical liberalism. Harvey Mansfield, for example, says that the traditional role of the American conservative is to preserve the liberal tradition. George Will says the same. Robert P. George says the same. The American conservative has traditionally wanted to preserve the founding, the principles and ideals, the Enlightenment principles and ideals of the founding. Limited government, the rule of law, property rights, separation of powers, including an independent judiciary, freedom of expression, freedom of worship and non-worship, freedom of assembly, pluralism, a pluribus unum, and so on and so forth. As I said to Mansfield once, who are your guys? He said, well, I'll take the founders, as disparate as they were, plus Lincoln, plus Frederick Douglass, plus a few others. And this to me is American scripture.
Populism does not seem to me as inherently right or left. It can be harnessed in the service of any different sort of philosophical orientations, because it's really a movement of people. It's the mobilization of people towards ends, but those ends can change. When people become disgruntled,
it's just based on grievance.
There's a lot of grievance.
Very powerful thing.
Can it be used?
I'll give you some George Will, who quotes Robert Graves. I think it was Robert Graves who said, so there's 7 deadly sins, right? And I think Graves said, envy is the only one that doesn't give you even momentary pleasure. And George Will says, I'll pause while you go down the list of the others. And when politicians harness it, and they can harness it responsibly and irresponsibly, this feeling of anti-elitism and the fancy people are doing me down, and it can be harnessed responsibly, and it can go either way.
Yeah, I almost wonder if our own period is analogous to like the invention of the printing press. Well, but even earlier, the inventing of the advent of the printing press, and the Protestant Reformation, and the Bible being translated into common tongue, and there's much upheaval. There's religious discord and wars across Europe, and it's almost as though technology is ahead of human ability to cope with it.
This very controversial thing, the end point of history. Recently I've been reacquainting myself with a speech that Calvin Coolidge gave on July 4th, 1926. What was that date? The 150th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. And today you hear about post-liberalism, which may have different meanings. But Coolidge says in that speech, essentially, there is no post. There's only going backward. There's only before. Either all men are created equal, or they aren't. Either individuals have rights independent of the state or the collective, or they don't. And it's wonderfully crafted. And there is going back to birth, heredity, station, tribe, all that stuff. But we have this funny phrase, the American experiment. Strange phrase. It is kind of an experiment because it's something new in human affairs. This pluralism and living together and allowing individual rights beyond the reach of majorities, as Justice Jackson said. Very tricky thing, this Madisonian conservatism that's supposed to restrain popular passions. And can it last? It's lasted a while.
Well, you remind me that taking the long view is not necessarily a forward-looking thing only. You hear a lot of, let's just say, proponents of ESG, the Environmental, Social, and Governance Investing movement, talking about, well, we need to take the long view to assess risk on climate change or any number of categories. But taking the long view is also looking backward to a past that has actually existed and not just looking forward to a hypothetical future that may or may not transpire.
The leading conservative virtue, I think everyone agrees, whatever we think of the virtue, is prudence. Now, there are other virtues in conservatism and life, but it's a look before you leap, first do no harm, don't make things worse. There's a famous aphorism, if it's not necessary to change, it's necessary not to change. I could argue that either way. And I think all of us have a certain streak of conservatism and a certain streak of radicalism, maybe. But Yeah, if prudence dictates certain environmental policies, of course. In fact, a decent stewardship of the earth, it's hard to separate conservation from conservatism. They come from the same thing. Yeah. But these initials that you've used, this DEI and the other initials.
ESG.
Mm-hmm. They can be wielded as weapons, as blunt instruments, you know, and that has to be watched. There's always bullying in politics on campus and elsewhere. You have to beware of the bullies. They can reason things out fine, but if you have to bully your way through, maybe your arguments aren't very good.
Well, I want to return to music in the last minute that we have, so we don't have much time left.
What a relief.
And
Sorry I've talked so much, Alan. You've asked about
that's what
3
you're here to
questions.
do. That's why you're here. You're here to talk. But I want you to tell me about the importance of music to society, to civilization, and whether our musical tastes in the current culture are or have the potential towards either decadence or degradation.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, the arts are a little bit like writing, right? You can do anything in writing, for good or ill. Bad stuff, good stuff. Writing is a medium or an art sometimes. And so it is with music and painting and dance and so on. But God, I was about to say an adornment to life, an important accessory to life. But maybe, well, for many people, this stuff is more central than that, more central than an adornment, you know. Paul Jonty used to speak of adornments to life, that something or so-and-so would add to the gaiety of life. That was one of his expressions. And for some, music is indispensable. Music is air and water. And for others, it's a pleasant diversion. And I think that, you know, music happens to mean a lot to me, but I think people ought to find their joys, their pleasures, their passions, their diversions, as long as they don't harm others.
Well, Jay, it's been a pleasure. Thank you for being on the show. This has been Success Stories, a program of the Sorrell College of Business. I'm Alan Mendenhall. Until next time.